Welcome to the Week 11 lecture for Criticizing TV. Today, we're going to be building off of our discussions of reception theory and ideology and group identity to talk about cultural work. Now, what is cultural work? So, cultural work is basically the process by which texts and images, in our case, television, enable those who share a culture to either one, reinforce their current patterns of thinking, of feeling, and of acting toward their own group and toward others. Or they can rehearse new patterns of thinking, of feeling, and of acting toward their own group and others. Boiled down, that is what this concept is basically the process by which a bit of television, in our case, impacts how the viewers understand their world. So this idea was introduced by a literary critic named Jane Tompkins in 1986. She published this book called Sensational Designs. And overall, Jane Tompkins' argument was that we needed to rethink within the academy how we were defining kind of our classic texts of our cultures and what went into that. What exactly made something timeless or not? And she kind of brought up this argument that just because something didn't withstand the test of time doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't important in its moment. And she was particularly concerned with looking at our more pop cultural, specifically novels, she was looking at and the impact that those had on mass culture in shaping the ways that, particularly in the United States, we were thinking about ourselves and other people as a whole. So her overall argument was just because something is popular doesn't mean that it's not valuable, doesn't mean that it's not important, and in fact, it can tell us really a lot about our culture. So what does this have to do with what we have been talking about? Cultural work connects ideology, our process of encoding and decoding that we learned from Stuart Hall, reception theory, and audiences. So kind of building off all of those concepts. If we take a look back at Stuart Hall's reception theory, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago now, we have this idea that the writer or director encodes their ideology into their show, and the audience, after watching the show, has to decode that ideology and the underlying messages. So cultural work comes in on the audience's end. It's basically the idea of what does the audience do with the messages of that show? Do they incorporate it to kind of shore up their own ways of thinking of the world? Do they seek out ways of seeing the world through television that reflect what they already think to kind of reinforce those thought patterns? Or does the show challenge them and get them to think or feel or act in a new way? So examples of how we might see this kind of playing out. When we're looking at cultural work, we're always thinking kind of on a large scale of like audience as a whole or like groups within an audience, not necessarily on an individual level. So the first example of something that has cultural work kind of reinforcing our ideas, I immediately thought of the police procedural TV, which, if we think back to our Hollywood diversity report that we read in the first couple of weeks of class, those, as of recently, and I mean over the past couple of decades, they have been as well, they remain very, very popular. And what these police procedurals often do is reinforce our current ways of thinking about good and evil and who lies on which side, which is not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's just kind of our ideals of what we want to believe as an American culture. Our overall impression is that our good cops are always going to get the bad guy and protect all of the law abiding citizens. We want to believe most of our cops are good. We also want to believe that we ourselves are also aligned with the good guys. We want to believe that justice is always going to prevail. And usually in our shows, we see that happening within the course of an episode. The crime is committed, or we find out about it, and by the end of the show, everything's going to be resolved. The bad guy has been carted off to jail. The good guy has won. Justice has prevailed. And this kind of reinforces our ideas of what good and evil are, and that good and justice for the good guys should prevail. And I think part of the cultural work this is doing, even as our culture is kind of in the mainstream, having a more complex discussion of the police and their role in pursuing justice and whether or not that's happening, particularly with the Black Lives Matter movement gaining traction, particularly with a lot of our discussions of police brutality. We're seeing that pop up in these episodes. I had a conversation with my mom a few months ago while the protests were going on in Columbus. And she, most of her view living in a small town in New Hampshire, where she doesn't interact with the police a whole lot, her entire view of what the issue was kind of wrapped up in this episode of Blue Bloods that she watched, which is procedural cop TV, super popular right now. Um, and she's thinking from the perspective of the character who had to make a split-second decision, who was in fear for his life, which is often the argument that we're hearing from the police. And that episode that she was watching kind of had that effect of reinforcing the ideology that she had of the cops are always the good guys. They're always looking out for everyone as long as they're law-abiding citizens. So our example two, I thought a bit about our discussion last week about our kind of anti-hero superheroes. And this is a movement in the genre of kind of our superhero archetypes, where we're seeing our culture kind of rehearsing new ways of thinking about who our heroes are and what exactly we mean by good and evil. And with our kind of more complicated superheroes who aren't always the best of people, we're seeing more and more examples of heroes who are morally imperfect, who sometimes do bad things to achieve just ends. We kind of heard about the argument in Luke Cage that the ends justify the means, even if the way that he goes about getting justice for his community is a bit destructive and hurts our bad guys that we see. Ultimately, he's still a good guy in our eyes. He's still our hero. And we can kind of look past the questionable things that he might have done. We're also seeing a lot more interest in learning about our motivations and backstory of our villains, that we see in things like Disney's Maleficent. Wicked, the very popular Broadway musical, looks at the Wicked Witch of the West. We've got the Joker Batman movie that just came out. So we're kind of moving toward our understanding where our villains are coming from and our superheroes, instead of just immediately categorizing them as completely good or completely evil. Our villains aren't always wholly irredeemable and evil anymore. We're kind of getting to this point where we want to understand where they're coming from. So I could argue that the cultural work of this superhero genre, and especially the rise of our kind of anti-hero and our relatable villain, is this is working to kind of complicate our definitions of who and what counts as good and evil. And the boundaries of that seem to be getting a little bit more blurry. So, can a show do both of these things at the same time? Absolutely. If we think back to the article that we read for this week, looking at Muslim representation in the sitcom Little Mosque on the Prairie, we're seeing these very relatable Muslim characters in a culture that's often kind of hostile and has a lot of anti-Islam and a lot of Islamophobic sentiments. So we're seeing these Muslim characters as people on screen, as our protagonists, as facing these different situations in kind of funny ways. But at the same time, the author argues that because a lot of those situations are a lot of the situations are ascribed to the character's personal failings rather than any sort of structural issues. It allows us as the audience to kind of resist challenging that idea that some people are subject to structural oppression, that it is inherently unfair, that it's something that we should be working to change. It's a lot easier for audiences to kind of digest that, oh, it's because this guy specifically messed up in this specific way, and it's not a larger issue. It kind of makes it more palatable because it fits into our existing norm of not wanting to acknowledge structural oppression, and that idea that anybody completely on their own can make it and can succeed despite the odds. And at the same time, it's not necessarily letting us have that conversation of like, oh, we have a lot of inequality in North America. I think there's a lot of other examples of this in the shows assigned for this week. You can also look back at a lot of the shows that we've watched. Often, in terms of cultural work, a TV show isn't doing 100% reinforcing our ideas or 100% giving us new ways of thinking about our ideas or giving us new ideas entirely. Often, because it's portraying people and people are complicated, it might be doing a bit of both. Or, as was the case in Little Mosque on the Prairie, it might be resisting in some ways and pulling back in other ways to make the overall work more palatable to a large audience. So, in cultural work, it's not always quite so clear cut as this is pushing to reinforce the status quo, or this is very actively challenging it 100% of the time. Often we're somewhere in between. To respond to a wide range of audiences and all of their kind of intersecting and complex ways of viewing the world, our different group ideologies, and kind of taking all of that into effect to figure out what is going to be the most effective in getting our message across. Because if the audience doesn't end up decoding your message, or if they have a completely resistant view to it, then it's not going to make any change to the ideology, or it's not going to reinforce it in the way that you want it to, depending on what your goal is as a writer. So these concepts will come up again in our class discussion and in the discussion thread posted for this week. Check that out. And I will see you later this week.